If you're listening before sleep, you are in the right place. Some stories grow louder the closer you get to their end. Others grow quieter. They slow down, the way the wind slows before a storm crosses open water. The world becomes still, almost peaceful, and for a moment everything feels calm enough to forget that something has been moving beneath the surface all along. This story belongs to that kind of quiet. Because sometimes the most unsettling discoveries are not the ones that appear suddenly. They are the ones that have been watching for a very long time. You already know the places that revealed the system. The house that remembered me. The asylum that recorded my presence. The sanatorium that connected those locations across distance. And the hydrological station that measured when something within that network began to move again. Each place served a purpose. Memory. Archive. Connection. Measurement. But the unfinished circle marked on the chart inside the station had revealed something new. The movement through the system was not random. It was returning. And that meant there must be another place. A point within the network that did not simply remember or record or measure. A place that watched. I discovered that place in the same envelope that had led me north before. The station had not been the final message. It had only been a marker along the path. When I returned home from Lake Vira, the photograph on the table remained unchanged. The faint circle in the water beside the sanatorium was still incomplete, its thin line stopping just before closing. But inside the envelope I found another sheet of paper. This one was older. The edges of the page had yellowed slightly, and the ink of the handwriting had faded just enough to suggest that the message had been written many years earlier. At the top of the page was a name. Northern Astronomical Observation Station, built 1881. Below it, a set of coordinates had been written carefully across the center of the paper. And beneath those numbers, a single sentence appeared. It was first seen from here. The words did not explain what had been seen. They did not describe when. But something about the tone of the message felt different from the others. The previous letters had felt like instructions. This one felt like a record. As though someone had written it long ago and simply waited for the moment when it would be needed again. That night the house remained unusually quiet. No footsteps crossed the upstairs hallway. No shifting sounds moved through the walls. The building did not seem attentive the way it had during the earlier movements of the system. Instead, it felt settled. Almost patient. As though it already understood where the path was leading next. The coordinates on the paper pointed farther north than any of the previous locations. Beyond the forests of Karelia. Beyond the lake where the station stood above the water. The map showed a narrow mountain ridge overlooking a long valley of frozen lakes. And somewhere along that ridge, built more than a century ago, stood the observation station that had first seen whatever now moved through the network of places that should not remember. I left the following morning. The journey took nearly 2 days. The roads became narrower the farther north I traveled. Villages disappeared entirely, replaced by long stretches of forest and frozen ground where the wind moved quietly between the trees. By the time I reached the final road marked on the map, the sky had turned pale with early winter light. The observation station appeared suddenly between the trees as the road curved along the ridge. The building was larger than I expected. A stone structure with a round tower rising above the roofline, its dome still intact despite the years that had passed since anyone had used it. The walls were made of dark granite blocks that had weathered into a deep grey color. Above the entrance, carved into the stone archway, the date remained clearly visible. 1881. Older than the asylum. Older than the sanatorium. Older even than the station on Lake Vira. The place where the system had first been seen. The road ended a short distance from the entrance. When I stepped out of the car, the wind across the ridge carried a quiet sound through the valley below. The observation tower stood motionless against the pale sky, its dome pointed toward the empty space above the mountains. For a moment I simply looked at the building. The other places in the system had felt as though they were waiting for something. But the observatory felt different. It felt as though it had already been watching for more than a century. And whatever had first been seen from that tower in 1881 had never completely left the sky above it. The wind along the ridge carried a steady, low sound across the valley. Not a howl. Not the sharp rush of a storm. Just a long breath of cold air moving slowly between the granite walls of the observatory and the frozen ground below it. For several minutes I stood outside the building without approaching the door. Something about the place felt different from the other locations in the system. The house had welcomed me with quiet recognition. The asylum had measured my presence. The sanatorium had revealed connections between distant structures. The hydrological station had recorded the movement passing beneath it. But the observatory felt like a place that had never stopped looking. The round dome above the tower remained closed, its metal panels dulled by years of winter storms. Yet even from the ground I could see that the narrow slit in the dome still faced a specific direction across the sky. Not randomly. Deliberately. As though whoever built the structure had chosen that angle with great care. I walked slowly toward the entrance. The granite steps were worn smooth, their edges rounded by more than a century of wind and snow. Above the doorway the carved date 1881 looked deeper than the surrounding stone, the numbers cut with the kind of precision used in buildings meant to last. The door itself opened with surprising ease. Inside, the air was colder than outside. The stone walls held the chill of the mountain ridge, and the silence of the interior felt heavier than the quiet of the forest behind me. A circular hallway surrounded the base of the tower. Several wooden doors stood along the curved wall, each marked with small brass plates that had long since lost their polished shine. Charts hung beside some of the doors. Old star maps. Observational notes. Handwritten calculations drawn across yellowed paper. I moved slowly along the corridor, reading what I could. Most of the notes described ordinary astronomical observations. Planetary movements. Meteor showers. Seasonal star positions. But one set of pages looked different. The handwriting on those sheets was less careful, as though the observer had been writing quickly while watching something unexpected. The notes were dated. October 3, 1881, October 7, 1881, October 9, 1881. The final page held only a single line written across the center of the sheet. It does not remain where it was seen. The sentence had been underlined twice. Beneath it, the observer had drawn a small diagram. At first it looked like a simple map of the sky, several stars connected by faint lines. But as I studied it more closely, I realized the drawing did not match any constellation I recognized. Instead, the lines formed something else. A circle. Incomplete. The same symbol that had appeared on the chart inside the hydrological station. I stepped back from the page slowly. The observatory had not been built to track planets. Or comets. Or distant stars. It had been built to follow something that did not stay in one place. Something that moved. The tower staircase rose at the end of the circular hallway. Narrow stone steps spiraled upward toward the dome above. For a moment I hesitated before climbing. The other places in the system had revealed their purpose gradually. But here the purpose felt clearer. Someone had first seen the movement from this tower. And they had spent the rest of their time trying to understand where it would appear next. I climbed slowly. The stone steps were worn smooth in the center, evidence of years of careful observation by someone who had walked this path many times. At the top of the staircase, the circular room beneath the dome opened quietly around me. The telescope remained where it had been left. A long brass instrument mounted on a rotating base that still pointed toward the narrow slit in the metal dome above. Dust covered most of its surface, but the lens itself looked strangely clean. As though someone had wiped it recently. I stepped closer. The valley below stretched across the dark landscape beyond the ridge, the frozen lakes reflecting faint lines of pale winter light. Above that horizon the sky remained clear. Cold. Empty. For several seconds I looked through the telescope. At first I saw only stars. Bright points scattered across the dark sky. Then something moved. Not across the stars. Between them. A faint distortion. Almost like a shadow crossing the space where nothing should exist. It did not move quickly. It drifted slowly along a curved path across the sky. And for the briefest moment, the stars behind it bent slightly, as though the space between them had shifted. The observatory had not been watching the sky. It had been watching the path something took through it. And whatever had once been seen from this tower in 1881 was moving again. The distortion faded as slowly as it had appeared. For several seconds I remained looking through the telescope, expecting the shadow to return or shift again across the field of stars. But the sky above the ridge settled back into its familiar stillness, the distant lights fixed in their quiet patterns. Yet something about the view felt different now. The stars looked unchanged. But the space between them seemed deeper. As if the brief movement I had witnessed had revealed something hidden in the darkness behind them. I stepped away from the telescope. The observation room remained silent around me, the curved stone walls holding the same cold stillness as the corridor below. On the wooden desk beside the instrument lay several leather-bound journals. Their covers were worn but carefully preserved, the edges of the pages darkened by time. I opened the first one. The writing inside matched the hurried notes I had seen downstairs. Observational records. Dates. Coordinates. Most entries were short, describing faint movements that the observer had tracked across the sky during the autumn of 1881. But the descriptions grew stranger as the pages continued. October 12th, the object appears again, though not where expected. October 14th, movement does not follow celestial pattern. October 16th, position aligns with ground markers. That last entry caught my attention. Ground markers. The observer had not been measuring the movement of something in space alone. They had been comparing it to locations on Earth. I turned to the next page. There, drawn carefully across the paper, was a map. Not of the sky. Of the region surrounding the ridge. Small marks indicated several points across the landscape. A valley. A lake. A distant forest clearing. Lines connected those points into a rough circle. And beside each mark the observer had written a short note. Position estimated. Possible alignment. Further observation required. But one of those marks had been circled more heavily than the others. Beside it the observer had written a single word. House. My breath slowed slightly as I looked at the map. The system had not begun with the house. But the house had become part of the circle later. I turned another page. More points appeared on the map. One of them marked 1931 beside a small square symbol. The asylum. Another point had been added farther north beside the year 1926. The sanatorium. And near the edge of the lake region, the observer had drawn the location of the station from 1894. The entire system had been mapped here long before I discovered any of those places myself. The observatory had not only seen the movement in the sky. It had predicted where the path would touch the ground. I looked again through the telescope. The sky remained still. But the path drawn in the journals made more sense now. The distortion I had seen drifting between the stars had not been random. It had been following the same circular pattern that the buildings on Earth had been placed to measure. The system was not tracking something traveling across the world. It was tracking something orbiting it. The final pages of the journal contained only a few entries. The handwriting had grown slower, more deliberate. As though the observer had already understood what the system was becoming. November 3rd, the path repeats. November 6th, ground structures must be established. November 10th, circle incomplete. Beneath the final entry, the observer had drawn the same symbol I had seen inside the hydrological station. A circle. Not fully closed. And below it, one final sentence had been written across the bottom of the page. It returns when the circle is almost finished. I closed the journal slowly. The observatory had been the first place to see the movement. The other buildings had been built later to measure it, to remember where it appeared, to record when it passed, to connect the distances between those appearances, to measure its crossings. And now, more than a century later, the unfinished circle was almost complete. Outside the narrow slit of the dome, the stars remained steady in the dark sky. But somewhere along the invisible path between them, the distortion I had seen through the telescope continued moving slowly along its orbit, following the same route it had followed before, toward the places that had been waiting for its return. I left the journal open on the desk for several minutes before moving again. The pages did not flutter in the cold air of the tower. The observatory was too well sealed for the wind to reach inside. The silence around the telescope felt deeper than the quiet of the forests below. For more than a century this room had watched the sky. Not simply for stars. For movement. The observer who had written those journals had not been studying astronomy in the usual sense. They had been tracking a path, a pattern that crossed the sky and the earth at the same time. And when that pattern appeared again, the places built along the ground would feel it. The house would remember. The asylum would record. The sanatorium would connect. The station would measure. I walked slowly around the tower, studying the mechanisms attached to the telescope mount. Most of the brass fittings had tarnished over time, but the instrument itself had been preserved carefully. The rotation rings still moved with quiet precision when I placed my hand against them. Someone had maintained this place long after the original observer had disappeared. Perhaps not a person. Perhaps the system itself. On the opposite side of the tower stood another desk, smaller than the one holding the journals. Several thin metal rods extended from its surface toward the walls of the dome, forming a delicate frame around a circular glass plate mounted in the center. At first I thought it was simply another astronomical instrument. But when I leaned closer, I realized the glass plate had been etched with markings. Lines. Angles. Coordinates. The same circular path drawn in the journals downstairs. The instrument was not designed to observe the sky directly. It was designed to predict where the movement would appear next. The observer had built a model of the system. I touched the edge of the glass plate carefully. The etched circle matched the map drawn in the journal, each point corresponding to one of the buildings placed along the ground. House. Asylum. Sanatorium. Station. But one mark remained different from the others. At the northernmost point of the circle the observer had etched a small triangle beside the word origin. I stepped back slowly. The observatory had not been the beginning of the system. It had only been the place where the movement was first seen. The true beginning lay somewhere else. Somewhere along the circular path the system was measuring. Outside, the sky above the ridge remained clear. Yet the instrument on the desk seemed to react to something. The glass plate shifted slightly within its frame. Not visibly, but enough that the faint lines etched across its surface no longer aligned perfectly with the stars outside the dome. The path had moved. I turned toward the telescope again. This time I did not look immediately through the lens. Instead I watched the narrow slit of the dome. The opening faced the same section of sky the instrument had been aligned toward for more than a century. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the stars beyond the opening appeared to bend. Not much. Just enough to suggest that something was passing between the observatory and the distant lights. I leaned toward the telescope and looked through the lens once more. The distortion had returned. The faint shadow between the stars moved along the same curved path I had seen earlier, drifting steadily toward the horizon beyond the ridge. Toward the locations marked in the journals. Toward the circle the observer had drawn more than 100 years ago. For a moment the distortion grew slightly darker, its shape stretching across a wider section of sky than before. Then it thinned again, fading almost completely into the darkness between the stars. The movement had not stopped. It had only passed beyond the reach of the telescope. I stepped away from the instrument slowly. The observatory had done its work. It had watched the movement when it first appeared. It had helped map the circle along the ground. And now, more than a century later, the same path was unfolding again. But something in the tower felt different now. The air had grown slightly heavier. Not colder. Not tense. Just aware. As though the observatory itself understood that the system it had helped create was nearing the moment it had always been waiting for. Somewhere along that circle of buildings scattered across the forests and lakes of the north, the unfinished symbol was slowly closing. And when it did, whatever had been moving along the path since 1881 would no longer remain between the stars. For several minutes after the distortion disappeared from the telescope, I remained standing in the center of the tower. The silence inside the observatory had changed. Not dramatically. The wind still moved quietly along the ridge outside, brushing the metal panels of the dome with the same slow rhythm as before. But the air within the tower carried a different weight now. The system was no longer only being observed. It was approaching something. The unfinished circle drawn in the journal. The path etched into the glass instrument. The movement drifting slowly between the stars. All of it pointed toward the same conclusion. The circle was almost closed. I stepped back toward the smaller desk with the glass plate. The etched markings across its surface had shifted again. Not enough to be obvious at first glance, but the alignment between the instrument and the opening of the dome had changed slightly. The path had moved farther along its orbit. Closer to the final point. Closer to the place marked in the journal as origin. The observer who built this instrument had understood something important. The buildings across the landscape had not been placed randomly. They formed markers. Anchors along the path of the movement. Each structure allowed the system to track where the distortion passed across the sky and where it touched the earth below. But one place had existed before the rest. A location that had not been built to measure or record or connect anything. A place that had simply been there when the movement was first seen. The origin. I opened the final journal again. Near the back of the book another map appeared, drawn more carefully than the earlier sketches. The circle was the same. But this time the northern point held a larger symbol. A triangle drawn beside a small note. The structure beneath the ridge. Not an observatory. Not a station. Something else. I read the surrounding notes slowly. The observer had not discovered the origin while studying the sky. They had discovered it beneath the mountain itself. A natural chamber carved into the rock below the ridge where the observatory had later been built. The distortion had appeared there first. Not above the earth. Inside it. The observatory had been constructed later to track the movement once it began appearing in the sky. The other buildings had followed, placed along the predicted path where the movement would cross the surface again. The system had not been designed to contain anything. It had been built to follow it. Outside the dome the sky remained calm. Yet something in the tower shifted again. The glass plate on the desk rotated slightly within its metal frame, stopping with a soft click against the etched markings. The circle was almost aligned. One small gap remained between the final point and the beginning of the path. The same gap that appeared in the symbol drawn inside the hydrological station. The same gap that had appeared in the reflection on the photograph back in the house. The system had not finished its work yet. Because the movement had not reached the origin again. I turned toward the narrow staircase leading down from the tower. The observatory had watched long enough. The next place I needed to see was not above the ridge. It was beneath it. The chamber described in the journal lay somewhere below the granite foundations of the building. A place older than the observatory itself. Older than the circle. A place where the movement had first appeared in 1881, long before anyone understood that it would return again. As I began descending the stone steps, the quiet air of the tower seemed to follow me down the staircase. The observatory had spent more than a century watching the sky. But the path it tracked did not end there. It led back to the place where the circle began. The staircase beneath the tower descended deeper than I expected. Unlike the narrow spiral that led upward to the telescope room, these steps were cut directly into the granite beneath the observatory. The stone walls were rough and uneven, their surfaces worn smooth only in the center where footsteps had passed long ago. The air grew colder as I moved downward. Not the sharp cold of winter wind, but the steady chill of rock that had remained untouched by sunlight for centuries. At the bottom of the staircase the passage widened into a low tunnel. The journal had mentioned a chamber beneath the ridge, but the observer had not described how far it extended beyond the foundations of the observatory itself. The tunnel sloped gently forward through the stone. For a moment I stood still, listening. The wind above the ridge could no longer be heard here. Only the faint sound of distant water moving somewhere deeper within the mountain. I walked slowly into the passage. The floor had been cleared carefully long ago. Small metal brackets had been fixed into the walls at regular intervals, once holding lanterns that now hung empty and rusted. Whoever built the observatory had known about this place. But they had not created it. The tunnel walls were older than the building above. Rougher. Carved by something far older than tools. The passage opened suddenly into a wide chamber. The ceiling rose high above the floor, disappearing into darkness where the rock curved upward into the heart of the ridge. The walls formed a near-perfect circle around the center of the cavern. At first I thought the shape was natural. Then I saw the markings. Lines carved into the stone floor. A circle. Large enough to fill the center of the chamber. And just like the symbol I had seen throughout the system, the circle was incomplete. One narrow gap remained where the line had never been finished. The same unfinished mark drawn in the observatory journal. The same gap recorded on the chart at the hydrological station. The same thin break in the circle reflected in the photograph back at the house. The chamber beneath the ridge was the first place the movement had appeared. The observer in 1881 had not discovered the system by looking into the sky. They had discovered it here. Inside the earth. I stepped closer to the carved circle. The rock beneath my feet felt slightly warmer than the surrounding stone. Not warm in temperature. Warm in presence. As though something had once moved across the floor of the chamber and left behind a faint trace that had never completely faded. The lines carved into the stone matched the path recorded across the buildings above the ground. House. Asylum. Sanatorium. Station. Observatory. Each place marked a point where the movement passed along its orbit. Each place helped measure how close the circle had come to closing again. But the chamber beneath the ridge was different. It had not been built to observe the movement. It had been built because the movement had appeared there first. The unfinished gap in the circle lay directly in front of me. For a long moment I simply looked at it. Nothing moved within the chamber. No sound disturbed the cold air. Yet something about the space felt strangely patient. As if the cavern itself had been waiting. Above me, somewhere beyond the granite ceiling, the stars continued their slow motion across the sky. The distortion I had seen through the telescope was still traveling along its path. Moving between the buildings that formed the system. Approaching the final point. Approaching the origin. The circle was almost complete. But the last mark had not been drawn yet. I stepped back from the gap in the stone. The chamber remained still. The carved circle remained unfinished. Yet the quiet awareness in the air had changed. Not stronger. Closer. As though the movement I had seen drifting between the stars was no longer following the path above the earth. It was descending toward the place where it had first appeared. Toward the chamber beneath the ridge. Toward the unfinished line in the circle. And somewhere within the system of places that should not remember, the final distance was slowly closing. To be continued.